It's July 11th, 1979, around 2:30 p.m. at Dadeland Mall in Kendall, Florida. A white Ford Econoline van marked Happy Time, Complete Party Supply pulls into a lot full of suburban mothers shopping for summer dresses. Inside, are Colombian gunmen with MAC-10 machine pistols, vests, shotguns, and revolvers. They walk into Crown Liquors and find their target, trafficker German Jimenez Paneso, at the counter. Within 40 seconds, Paneso and his bodyguard, Juan Carlos Hernandez, are dead. Two clerks are wounded but alive. Shoppers scream and duck behind liquor shelves as glass shatters around them. The gunmen fire into the lot, climb back into the van and vanish into traffic. Police find the van abandoned hours later, packed with enough weapons to invade a small country, and call it the War Wagon. This wasn't a robbery or a gang feud. It was the Colombian cocaine war announcing itself to America inside a suburban mall. The press called it the Dadeland Massacre. A cop at the scene coined another name, the Cocaine Cowboys. Within 2 years, this network turned Miami into America's murder capital, filling the city with so many corpses that the medical examiner had to rent a refrigerated trailer to store them. That underworld became the real backdrop for a film that defined its decade, Scarface. Audiences in 1983 watched Tony Montana and assumed Brian De Palma was exaggerating. He wasn't. If anything, the real story was worse. This is how Miami became Casablanca with palm trees, how Cuban refugees, a lawless Colombian trafficking network, and a flood of American cash turned a sleepy retirement town into a free fire zone. It's the true story behind Scarface, the Mariel Boatlift, the Cocaine Cowboys, the Dadeland gunmen, and the bankers who laundered blood money while looking away. Tony Montana wasn't a documentary. He was a reinvention of the 1932 Scarface, itself based on Al Capone, updated with cocaine instead of bootleg liquor and a Cuban refugee instead of an Italian immigrant. To make it authentic, the screenwriter dug into the real story, which starts in April 1980. When Fidel Castro opened a port called Mariel and changed Miami forever. Before that, Miami in 1979 was tired, peeling hotels, an aging retiree population, declining tourism. Then, on April the 20th, 1980, Castro announced anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could sail from Mariel. Cuban exiles chartered shrimp boats and yachts to bring relatives home, but Castro also emptied his prisons and psychiatric hospitals, mixing criminals and patients among ordinary refugees. Roughly 125,000 Cubans arrived in South Florida over 6 months. Most were honest people seeking a new life, but hidden among them were an estimated few thousand hardened criminals. Some estimates put those with any record as high as 20,000, though most offences were minor or not even crimes in the US. The ones who mattered spilled into Little Havana with nothing to lose. They were called Marielitos, and the worst of them helped inspire Tony Montana. Federal agents described a new kind of criminal among the Marielitos, one who ignored the old exile community's rules, cared nothing for politics, and was willing to do what established Cuban gangs wouldn't: kill a rival's mother, kill his children, walk into a liquor store in daylight and empty a machine pistol into shoppers. Miami's Cuban underworld dated to the early 1960s, when middle-class Cubans fled after Castro's 1959 takeover. Some had run Havana casinos for American mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante Jr., and once Castro shut those casinos, they brought their skills north. By the mid-1970s, several had moved into cocaine. In 1976, the market was small and expensive, aimed at Hollywood and Wall Street. A kilo of pure Colombian product cost tens of thousands wholesale in Miami and generated several times that once cut and sold in Manhattan or Los Angeles. Cubans had the contacts, but they were middlemen. The real supply came from Medellin, controlled by men just becoming infamous: Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, Carlos Leda. They'd realized cocaine could be flown. A single twin-engine plane could carry hundreds of kilos, worth tens of millions wholesale, and South Florida's coastline airstrips and swamps were wide open. When the Marielitos arrived, the Colombians suddenly had a bottomless supply of disposable foot soldiers, men who'd kill for a few $1,000s with no local ties and nothing to lose. The Colombians stopped paying Cuban middlemen and began recruiting Marielitos directly. The old Cuban gangs pushed back, and the Colombians answered with violence Miami had never seen. One of the most feared traffickers was a woman, Griselda Blanco, born on Colombia's Caribbean coast in 1943 and raised in Medellin. By the time she reached Miami in the mid-1970s, she'd already run cocaine through Queens, New York. Short, heavy-set, and colder than even hardened killers, she pioneered the motorcycle drive-by hit: two gunmen on one bike, the passenger opening fire on a target's car at a red light. She's linked to dozens of murders, by some counts as many as 200. Her own son, Michael Corleone Blanco, was named after Al Pacino's Godfather character. They called her La Madrina, the godmother, and she became the model for the female drug lords who'd haunt Miami through the 1980s. By 1981, the bodies were piling up faster than the city could handle. Miami recorded 621 homicides that year, its bloodiest ever, overwhelming a medical examiner's office built for a few hundred autopsies annually. Officials stored bodies in a refrigerated trailer like a fast food chain would use. That November, Time magazine put Miami on its cover with the headline "Paradise Lost" and tourism cratered, yet the local economy didn't, because cash kept flowing regardless. By the early 1980s, an estimated 70% of all cocaine and marijuana entering the US passed through South Florida. Medellin traffickers moved tons of product monthly, worth billions in street value, and every dollar needed laundering. The Miami Federal Reserve Branch, unlike every other branch nationwide, ran a cash surplus of roughly $5 billion a year, unexplained excess 50s and hundreds. Banks and accountants knew, and little was done, because that money was building Brickell Avenue's skyscrapers, Key Biscayne condos, car dealerships, and boat dealers moving cigarette boats for cash, no questions asked. Into this stepped the men who inspired the Scarface legend. One was Mario Tabraue, a Cuban-American, not a Marielito, but a Miami-born son of a little Havana jeweler. Charismatic and ruthless, he built a smuggling network worth an estimated $75 million over a decade, moving marijuana and cocaine, keeping a private menagerie of tigers and panthers on an estate as extravagant as the movie itself. He calls himself the real Tony Montana, though the claim owes more to legend than fact. Oliver Stone couldn't have studied Tabraue's case, since he wasn't publicly known until his 1987 arrest, years after the script was written. Tabraue was convicted in 1989 on racketeering charges, sentenced to 100 years, and served about 12 before release for cooperating with prosecutors. His crew murdered a federal informant and dismembered the body, a detail Hollywood didn't need to invent. When Stone researched the film in Miami in 1982, he went to primary sources, police who showed him graphic case file photos, and traffickers he sat with in Bolivia and Ecuador, returning with stories nobody in Hollywood believed until they saw the autopsy photos. Even the film's infamous chainsaw scene was based on a real incident. Another model was Sal Magluta, who, with partner Augusto Falcon, formed a duo called Los Muchachos. Unlike Tabraue, they were Miami-raised Cuban Americans who'd attended Miami Senior High together, racing speedboats on Biscayne Bay. By the mid-1980s, they were among the largest cocaine traffickers in the US, moving over 75 tons of product between 1978 and 1991 and amassing a fortune near $2 billion. They ran offshore powerboat racing teams and lived in mansions. Indicted in 1991, they bribed jurors and beat the case. It took prosecutors another decade to convict them on money laundering and obstruction instead. Magluta is serving 195 years in a federal supermax. Falcon was deported to the Dominican Republic. The pattern repeated across the trade. Speedboats from the Bahamas under cover of darkness, twin-engine Cessnas dropping cocaine bales into the Everglades, and front companies, construction firms, jewelry stores, dealerships laundering the cash. Underneath ran relentless violence. Bodies in Cadillac trunks at Miami International Airport, drive-by shootings on Biscayne Boulevard. By some counts, over 2,000 drug-related killings scarred Miami in the first half of the 1980s, roughly 2 a day for years. The federal government finally responded. In 1982, Vice President George H.W. Bush set up the South Florida Task Force, DEA, FBI, Customs, Coast Guard, IRS, and ATF, under one command, backed by radar planes, offshore cutters, and hundreds of wiretaps, with a White House mandate to shut Miami down. They seized billions in cocaine and made thousands of arrests, believing they were winning. They weren't. The cartels simply shifted their main route to Mexico, flying loads north and trucking product across Juarez and Tijuana. The Mexican cartels inherited the world's most profitable trafficking business, and within a decade, the dominant names were Mexican, not Colombian: Sinaloa, the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas. The seeds of every modern North American drug war were planted in Miami in those years. Miami itself kept changing. The cocaine money that stained the city also built it. By the mid-1980s, downtown Miami had a real skyline. Brickell Avenue lined with bank towers financed partly by laundered money legitimized through real estate. The Mutiny Hotel in Coconut Grove, unofficial headquarters of the Cocaine Cowboys, where Magluta, Falcon, and Tabraue held court, was eventually shut down, but the money it generated had already poured into condos, restaurants, galleries, and the renovation of South Beach. Today's glittering Miami of Art Deco hotels and luxury shopping was built atop dead bodies and white powder. There was a human cost, too. Thousands of Marielitos who'd committed no crimes were warehoused in federal detention because the government denied them legal starters. In November 1987, Cuban detainees seized federal prisons in Atlanta and Oakdale, Louisiana. Protesting planned deportations, more than 2,000 inmates across both facilities. The Atlanta standoff lasted 11 days, the longest prison siege in American history. The stigma against Marielitos lingered for decades, tarring honest refugees by association with the criminal minority Castro had mixed in among them. The original cocaine cowboys met their ends one by one, often violently. No one was ever convicted for the Dadeland Massacre, though it traced to Griselda Blanco's network. A suspected gunman, Carlos Ramirez, was killed in Colombia about a year later. Blanco was arrested in 1985, convicted of cocaine conspiracy and murder, and deported to Colombia in 2004 after nearly 20 years in custody. On September 3rd, 2012, walking out of a Medellin butcher shop, a motorcycle gunman shot her twice, killing her, the same method she'd used on so many others. Tabraue served his time and is now a South Florida businessman running a private zoo. Magluta will die in prison. Falcon was deported. Pablo Escobar was killed on a Medellin rooftop in 1993. Carlos Leda, after testifying against Panama's Manuel Noriega, spent decades in a U.S. prison before release in 2020 and deportation to Germany. The Ochoa brothers served their sentences in Colombia, and Tony Montana, the fictional Cuban with the gold chains, white suit, and mountain of cocaine, became the most enduring legacy of all.
The film split critics in 1983. Some recoiled at the violence, while Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars and later called it a great film. Over 4 decades, Scarface became a cultural monument. Al Pacino, with a machine gun on dorm walls in hip-hop videos in barbershops from Brooklyn to Bogota. Tony Montana became shorthand for one version of the American dream, arriving with nothing and taking everything by force, a dream that ends face down in a fountain of your own blood. What the movie understood, and what Miami itself understood, was that this was never just about drugs. It was about a new kind of money, untaxed, unregulated, soaked in violence, but real enough to build cities and buy judges, politicians, police chiefs, and bankers. The cocaine cowboys were the unlicensed architects of modern Miami. The city today is their monument, the Brickell skyline, the Bayside condos, the yacht slips and boutiques of Lincoln Road, all tracing back to cocaine smuggled ashore in the dead of night and bodies piled on the medical examiner's loading dock. That's the truth Hollywood came closest to getting right. Tony Montana was fiction, but the bullets were real, the kilos were real, and the blood in the gutters of Coconut Grove, Little Havana, and Hialeah was real. The $5 billion in unexplained cash sitting in the Miami Federal Reserve every year was real. And the men who fired McTenn's Inside Crown Liquors at Dadeland Mall on July 11, 1979, weren't movie characters. They were a warning the country didn't hear in time, that some doors, once opened, never close again. Miami learned that lesson the hard way. America never quite did.
If you want more deep dives into hidden worlds like this, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.